So welcome again. We are working through the book of Mark. If I say Matthew, I have been saying Matthew all week as I've been preparing. I had Matthew in my notes instead of Mark. So if I say Matthew, just bear with me. But it is Mark. We're in Mark chapter 7. We're almost halfway through the book. We're going through our series going from beginning to end through the gospel or the account of Jesus' life as it's recorded in the book of Mark. Today we're going to start out with an encounter that Jesus had with the Pharisees. Now, here's how I'm going to format the day so you know where we're going. I'm going to read a portion. We'll talk about that. I'll read a little more. We'll talk about that. We're not going to do the whole chapter, but we're going to do a significant portion of chapter 7. The story where we dive in is Jesus having an encounter with the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day, the Jewish religious leaders. They were highly educated, smart people. They knew the law of God, and they were very well educated in the tradition of the elders, or the interpretation of the day at that time of what they felt like the law of God, how it was supposed to be lived out. And we'll see this as we go along. So starting in Verse 1. Now, when the Pharisees gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of the disciples ate with hands that were defiled. That is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, according to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" Luke chapter 6 says something interesting about the Pharisees. It says the scribes and the Pharisees watched Jesus. And in this case, in the book of Luke, it says they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath. But they watched him so that they might find a reason to accuse him. So if you read through the accounts of Jesus' life, you'll notice that at almost every turn, when Jesus encounters the Pharisees, they're looking to see what he's doing wrong. They're not looking maybe at his teaching or what he's saying, though there were a few things there they took issue with. But they're looking to see if he's living according to the traditions that they have decided are the best interpretation of the law of God. And they're looking to find a reason to accuse him. And throughout the accounts of Jesus' life, this is just one. In this account, they're not very happy that he and his disciples, his followers, don't wash their hands. We're not talking about the washing hands like I have 4 kids, and when the kids were little and they got to the table and you said, "Did you wash your hands?" You'd be playing out in the mud. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a ritual of hand washing that was part of their tradition. So, they were looking for ways to tear him down, to find fault, and to accuse him. Jesus and the Pharisees and Jesus. So here are some of the things. Over the course of Jesus' life, when he encountered these religious leaders, here are some of the things where they found fault with him. One is what we saw today, that he broke the traditions of the elders. The other one is that he did what was unlawful on the Sabbath. And this ties in. The Sabbath was their day of rest. And really, God did want his people to rest. And yet how this was interpreted over the years, there became some traditions and some rules to follow that weren't actually originally in the law of God. It was an interpretation of it. So they thought he was doing things that were unlawful on the Sabbath according to their traditions. And one time it was because he healed somebody. That they said he brought healing and life and wholeness into somebody's life. And instead of rejoicing in what God did in somebody's life, they were accusing him of doing what was unlawful on the Sabbath. Here's the other big thing where the Pharisees found fault with Jesus. Not in this account, but in many others. It was that he ate with tax collectors and sinners. Now, tax collectors, we've heard before, they were the worst of the worst because they were Jewish people who worked for the Roman government, collect taxes not only for the sake of the government, but also there was always a good portion that went into their pockets. So they were really despised among their own people. And sinners was a whole category of who knows what all fell into there. But Jesus ate with those people, and he spent time with them, and that the Pharisees found that was something where they found fault and they brought accusation against him. Let's keep reading a little bit. Let's see Jesus' response when they've accused him of breaking with the traditions of the religious leaders. Let's go on with Matthew chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. And he, Jesus, said to them, "Well did Isaiah, an Old Testament prophet, prophesy about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." So that was the quote from Isaiah. And then Jesus says, "You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." You know, this is Jesus. Jesus continually, when he teaches, he says, I want to get into your heart. I want to look at the heart of something. It's not the traditions. It's not how you honor me or what you say with your lips. But what's going on in your heart and inside of you? And Jesus said things like, regarding some of the 10 Commandments even. He said, you've heard it say, you shall not murder and you shouldn't murder. But he said, even if you have hatred and call your brother a liar, in your heart, you've already murdered your brother. He said about adultery. He said, the law of God said, you do not commit adultery. Do not sleep with someone who isn't your husband or wife. And Jesus said, you've heard this, and it's true. He said, but let's go into the heart of the matter. If you lust after someone, you've actually committed adultery against them. So Jesus is forever digging into the heart, because it's what's in the heart of man and woman that counts. And the Pharisees that he was continually encountering were looking for behaviors and external things, and they were missing it. They missed the goodness of God walking among them because they were caught up in their religious thoughts and interpretations and ideas. An aside is that this portion of Mark that we're looking at is also recorded in the book of Matthew in chapter 15. And there's a few extra verses in 15, a little bit more detail. And it says that when Jesus called them hypocrites, the disciples came to him and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended by what you just said? Yeah, the Pharisees were offended. You just said that they honor me with their hearts are from me and you're a hypocrite. Their heart was far from God. Go on in Mark chapter 7, verses 14 and 15. And he, Jesus, called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And continuing on, verses 20 to 23, he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a person. So his interaction with the Pharisees, they thought that what might defile them was dirty hands or not following through some ritual practices. And Jesus, again, let's go to the heart. It's what's inside of us that defiles us. We're going somewhere with this. Jesus and the Pharisees, over time, here are some of the things he said about them. They said some things about him. Well, he said some things about them. He said, you clean the outside of the cup. In other words, you wash the outside. But you are full of greed, self-indulgence, and wickedness. In fact, he said to them, you're like whitewashed tombs. Like a tomb where you bury somebody. You look good on the outside, but you're full of dead man's bones. Here's something else Jesus said over time to the Pharisees. He said, you do all these things, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law. So he's actually going back to the law of God. He said, you neglect the weightier matters of the law. Justice and mercy and faithfulness. For all the detailed things that the religious leaders were concerned about, they were missing the heart of God, the weightier matters, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. And yet, in all of this, and the conflicts between the Pharisees and Jesus, and some of the really difficult, the clashes that they had in very public things, and there were large groups of people seeing this going on in the dialogue between them, some of the greatest lessons that we hold to today from the New Testament were actually things that were spoken either to the Pharisees as a group or to individuals. Even today's words of Jesus were words spoken to a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who came to Jesus with some questions, all on his own with some questions. And something that we as Christians hold to, that idea of being born again, were actually words that Jesus spoke to one Pharisee, one man who's exploring the things of God. There's other great lessons, great life lessons, and great things that we hold on to in our Christian faith that actually Jesus directed. The hearers were Pharisees. So he would be frustrated with them. He would call them whitewashed tombs and tell them they're clean on the outside and dirty on the inside. And yet, we can also see his heart, to see them know the heart of God. There is one of the lessons on the heart of God. The first one that came to mind was that when you're forgiven a little, you love little, and when you're forgiven much, you love much. In the context was Jesus going into the home of a Pharisee for dinner, a man named Simon, and a prostitute came. And Simon was pretty offended that Jesus would have this prostitute in his presence. And Jesus told a parable, and it was a great picture of forgiveness and our heart towards God. He said, there was a money lender, and two guys owed him money. One owed him a lot and one owed him a little. And the money lender forgave them both. And then he turned to Simon the Pharisee and he said, who would love him more? The one who he forgave a little debt to, or the one who he forgave a whole lot to? And Simon obviously said, well, the one to whom where the debt was greater. And Jesus said, you answered well. And then he turned to the prostitute and he said, she has been forgiven much, and therefore she loves much. And, sometimes we take that and we think, well, I've never sinned this much. My sins are little. That wasn't the point of the message. The point was, when we look at what Jesus looks at in our heart, we realize none of us have a leg to stand on before God. We have no righteousness within ourselves. And as we grow in our faith and our understanding of God and realize it's about what he's done and his forgiveness and his loving kindness in our life, we just realize how much we're loved and how much we're forgiven. And our response to that is to love much in return. And that is really the growth of faith in every Christian heart and in every Christian life. That the more we realize just how much we've been forgiven and the price that was paid, the greater our love and response and worship to God is. The second lesson of the heart, and this, interestingly enough, this was about Jesus' heart for lost people. And as we go on, I'm jumping out of Mark for a minute here. I'm jumping into Luke because I think it's an important lesson. I'm going to jump back to Mark because in a minute we're going to see Jesus encounter with someone who didn't know God, and we're going to see his loving kindness and compassion towards her. But there was a time when there were Pharisees, a group of them. There were tax collectors and sinners, and there were Pharisees and scribes gathered around Jesus, and the Pharisees and scribes were grumbling once again about Jesus' actions. And they were saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. In other words, he spends time with people who are far from God. He gives his time to people who are far from God. And they're grumbling and complaining about this. And Jesus' response to that crowd of people, tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, and scribes, some other religious leaders, were to tell three of probably the best known parables in the New Testament, or stories that Jesus told to illustrate something. And they were three stories about stuff that's lost, recorded in Luke chapter 15. One was about a man who had 100 sheep, and one of them was lost, and he left the 99, and he went in search of the one that was lost. And one was about a lady who had 10 coins, and one of them disappeared, and she swept her house and cleaned it until she found her lost coin. And Jesus said, in those illustrations, he said, this is how God responds when someone who is far from God comes close to him. That's the rejoicing that's in heaven in the midst of the angels, when someone who is far from God draws close to him. And the third story that Jesus told to the Pharisees on that day was the story of what we call the prodigal son, but it's really a story about two sons. One who religiously and faithfully did all the right things, and one who strayed and went and lived the wild life. And how the father in this story waited for and watched for and rejoiced and celebrated when that son returned to him. And it was a picture of a God who loves the lost and who looks for and reaches. In fact, this is what Jesus said about himself. He said that he came, his purpose, he came to seek and save the lost, to seek and save those who were far from God. So life lessons that Jesus brought to the Pharisees, that when you're forgiven much, you know how much you're forgiven, your response is love. And that Jesus' whole purpose was to come and seek and save lost people. Let's go on. Let's continue. So there's the Pharisees and a few different examples of Jesus' interaction with Pharisees over the course of his life. And yes, he had hard and difficult words for them, but he was also trying to illustrate to them the God who loved them and who was seeking them and seeking their hearts, and paint pictures for them of what it might look like to be born again, to come and to know the Father. Let's continue reading the book of Mark in chapter 7. Now we're going to read 25 to 30. Because now we're going to actually watch Jesus' encounter with someone who was far from him. And we're going to watch his kindness and his compassion. And at first, some of the words he says to her, you're going to go, he said, what? To what lady? But let's read this together. But immediately a woman whose daughter had an unclean spirit. Now, Western world, we don't think too much about the spiritual realm, but we think natural things. But there is a spiritual realm, and there is good and evil in it. And what it looked like that this girl had an unclean spirit, that's not clear. But part of the story is that this woman's daughter had an unclean spirit. So she heard of him, and she came and she fell down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she begged him to come and cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, let the children be fed first. For it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Okay, she's coming and asking for Jesus, something for Jesus. She's asking him to heal her child, and he is maybe calling her a dog. At least it sounds that way in that moment. But she answered him. She was going to fight for something. I think she knew something about him. She answered him, and her response was clever and good. Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And he said to her, for this statement, you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter, and she went home and she found her daughter well. She came to him. She had a few strikes against her. Culturally, she was a woman, and we've seen other encounters with Jesus and women, and at that time, women probably would not approach a religious leader. So she was a woman. She was a Syrophoenician. So, in other words, she was a Gentile. She wasn't a Jew. In Matthew's account of this same story, Jesus actually says to her, I came for the, I think he said the lost, I think he said, I came for the lost sheep of Israel. In other words, he said to her, I didn't come for you. You're a Gentile. I did not come to at this time intervene in your life. I came for Israel. She wasn't an Israelite. She had no ground to stand on. She was a woman. She was a Syrophoenician. And her daughter was unclean. Now, when you go back and you look at the law of Moses, I've been reading Leviticus right now, and it's all about all the things that make someone and something unclean, and there's long lists of things, but here's the end of it all, is that when you're unclean, you can't go to the temple or the synagogue, and other people aren't supposed to be around you. So she's stepping out here. She's a woman, she's a Gentile, her child is unclean, she has no basis on which to come to Jesus. But obviously there was something. In fact, in Matthew's account, he commends her for her faith, and he heals her daughter. Jesus' heart, and Jesus, the expression of who he wasn't what the Pharisees were looking for. They thought religious leaders were supposed to keep some certain external things, and Jesus kept saying, well, let's go to the heart, let's go to the heart. And here's an expression of Jesus' heart. Even to those outside of who his purpose was to reach at that time, he was compassionate. And he heard her, and he pushed a little bit on her, and he healed her daughter. That dog thing, I don't completely understand it. However, I do know that sometimes the Jewish people of the day did just refer to Gentiles as dogs, period. So we'll move on from there. So here's where we're at. There's the religiosity that sometimes burdens all of us. Hey, I'm not just going to point fingers at the Pharisees, because sometimes I think each one of us can get in our mind what it looks like to live the good Christian life. In fact, sometimes we think there's maybe certain things where we should step back and not go close to people who are sinners and tax collectors and unclean. And yet, what we see in the life of Jesus is those were the very people. They were like magnets to him. He was drawn to the people who were far from him. And he intervened in their life, and he did miraculous things for them, and he demonstrated the love of God for them. You know, there's a lot of people around us who are like that woman. That's our world. Lots of people who are far from any knowledge of God. And maybe rather than being separatists, kind of like the Pharisees were, or falling into that the only people I spend my time with are people who look like me and act like me and keep my same religious traditions. Maybe the heart that Jesus wants in us is the one that says, I'm going to step outside of a place where I usually am. You know, he had entered somebody's home here to talk to this woman, and it was actually outside of, like, it was in Tyre and Sidon, which really wasn't a Jewish part of the country. He went places where other people didn't go. He did eat with sinners and tax collectors. And maybe the inspiration for us as we read things like this is not just to judge and criticize the Pharisees, but to look and go, what times in my life do I separate myself and not step into those places where there are people who don't look like me, don't act like me, don't know my Jesus, but that's where I'm supposed to be. Jesus said in a couple of different locations in the Gospels we see recorded, he said, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. The leaven of the Pharisees. And even his followers said, what, their bread? And he said, no, I mean the teaching. Beware of the teaching of the Pharisees. And we looked at a few different things where the Pharisees' mindset was, but he said, beware of it. He said, because it's like leaven. Now, I bake bread. I love baking bread. I probably should have brought bread for everybody as an example, but I didn't. Here's the fascinating thing for all my years of baking bread that's still fascinating to me. The leaven, the yeast. You have a little lump of dough like this, but those little tiny, they look like little tiny beads of yeast, get mixed in there, and with the right conditions, that little lump becomes a full loaf of bread. And it's fascinating, and it's delicious, and it smells wonderful. But the picture in that is that when little grains of teaching and thinking and wrong get into our hearts, it can infect and affect the entire way we live. Jesus said, beware of some of the things where the Pharisees got tripped up. Beware of those things. And maybe for us, one of those dangerous things is that idea that we're supposed to live our lives separate from people who don't know God. Oh, don't go there because that might be a bad place, or don't spend your time with those people. Maybe what we're supposed to do is be inspired and stirred by the life of Jesus, who did spend his time with those who didn't have any concept of God, who were far from him. And that's why we as this church, if you ever click on our website, and if you've gone through a membership class, we have some things that we say we as a church value. And the number one thing on our list of values is this. We say we're going to be a culture. We're going to have a culture in this church of engaging. We want to be outward focused. This is what we aspire to. This is what our dream is. Are we perfectly good at it? No, we're going to work hard to get towards this. We want to be an outward focused church. We want to be engaging. We want to attract those outside the church. We want to make it easy for people to connect with our church and make it easy for them to explore the Christian faith. We want a culture of engaging. We want that to be what's on the inside of us. Not that thing that says stay far and I just have to be around my circle of safe people and safe friends. But what's it look like to step into the world and the lives of people who don't know our Jesus? We want to make it easy for people to connect with Jesus. And the way they do that is from us spending time and demonstrating the love of God to them. As I close today, we have a little card. True Confessions. I gotta find mine. I have one here somewhere. We have a little card. We call it our Pepsi card. And this is our, I'll call it a plan. That's not the word I'm looking for, but this is our reminder. Thank you. This is our reminder to stick in our wallet and to be thinking about the people in our circle of influence who maybe have never even taken a first step on a faith journey. And this is our reminder to pray for them. There's a place on the back of the card to write their names. I'm not good at stuff like this, writing cards and keeping them in my wallet. This is not a strong point for me. But I love the concept of the card, and there are people that I pray for in my life, though I haven't written them on the back of my card. The next thing on the list, and some of these maybe aren't in any particular order, though the pray one is good to come first, is eat. Who is it that maybe you should take out for a coffee or buy a lunch for, or if you like to bake or cook, make some of that bread and give it to the neighbor, the people next door. Who is it that you can bless? And by bless, we mean things like, I found out somebody is moving, and how can I volunteer to use my pickup truck? Or how can I meet the needs of people around me? Because that's what Jesus did. He ate with people, and he looked for ways to meet their needs. And maybe for us it isn't laying hands or praying for a child that is demon-possessed, but maybe it's cutting the grass of your elderly next-door neighbor, or taking out the trash, the garbage of the people, your other neighbors who have gone away to the cottage for the weekend. How can we connect people? How can we bring people that we know into our sphere of influence? And what is it that we can invite them to? Just reminders of ways to connect with people around us, the people that we work with, our workmates, our classmates, our neighbors. I wish I could say I was super good at this, and I'm not, but I work hard towards it. And and I look for little things, and I make baby blankets. So the really good thing is that a couple of our neighbors, since we've lived in our house, have had babies. And I love making baby blankets, so I take one of my passions and I make a baby blanket, and I give it to my completely shocked neighbors who've never had someone who's just a neighbor make something for their child. And still our neighbors talk about the baby blankets, and their kids are 3 and 2. And is it a big thing? Well, it touched their heart, and it opened the door for other conversations with our neighbors. We have new neighbors. I was really sad our next door neighbors who we'd started to get to know were moving away, and so we have new neighbors. And when I knew the people next door were moving, I started to pray that God would bring the people beside us that are supposed to be there. And I'm really excited as Bert and I are starting to get to know them. I'm asking the Lord, what are ways that we can start to build with this couple, and just to show the kindness and the love of God towards them. So pray, eat, bless, connect, invite. This week I'm super excited. I'm trying something completely different. I love thrift stores and old things. And in our neighborhood, one of the churches has the best thrift sale, rummage sale around once a year. And last year I found out I can volunteer at it. So this week I've cleaned out my calendar so I can go and serve in my neighborhood, and all the money raised goes to, last year I think I went for clean water. But it's also a way of serving my neighborhood and my community. And I'm really excited. I can't wait for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And I don't know what will become of it, but I want to be Jesus. I want to demonstrate Jesus where I live and the people around me. We want to be an engaging church. We want to be outward focused, and that starts with us as individuals. And as we close today, this week in our small groups, so we have these white cards. We have a blue card we started with. We also have this white card. And the white card is next steps, what's yours? And I just believe for each one of us that there's always something maybe more that God's prodding and pushing us to do. Number 3 on the white card is get involved in a small group. And maybe you're not involved in a small group yet, and maybe you've been thinking, our small groups meet once a week, and they're probably people like you, and maybe they are, and maybe they aren't, and you need to get to know them. But step number 3 on here is get involved in a small group. This week in our small groups, actually what we're going to do with our small group material is work together through this. Who should we be praying for? How can we prompt and prod one another to actually reach out and eat and bless and connect with people who don't know Jesus? So we have a next step card, and as we close today and as the team comes up to lead us in one more song of worship, if you have your card with you, take it out and consider. There's the other things on here, maybe you've never taken that moment to say, it's time for me to follow Jesus, as Bert was talking earlier on. And maybe it's time, and May 6th we're having baptisms, maybe it's time that, but consider this. But maybe it's time to get involved in a small group, because it's one thing to come and hear somebody talk, and then it's another thing to sit with a group of peers and wrestle through, what does this look like in my life? So take a minute today and think and pray about this, and perhaps that's the next step for you. And our team's going to lead us.